So today's sermon is the third monthly installation on the sermon series I'm doing this year on Tima Okun's Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture. We're doing that as a next step from our congregations adopting the 8th principle last year, which calls on us to actively dismantle systems of racism and oppressions in ourselves and in our communities. So these characteristics of white supremacy were first articulated by Tima Okun about a decade ago, and they've been used and adapted by faith communities, nonprofit organizations, activists, and those working against racism in their words and actions. I'll be referencing Okun's words liberally through this. The invitation in these sermons is to investigate how these characteristics and qualities lead to disconnection from each other, ourselves, and all living things, and how the antidotes can support us to reconnect. In October, we explored perfectionism. We're still perfecting that one, aren't we? In November, we explored urgency. We're working on that one right away. And this month, in the month of overconsumption, gluttony, and consumerism, we're exploring the characteristic of quality over quantity. Now, this is a topic that many of us in the faith field discuss around the December holidays in other years, but I've never explored it as an antidote to white supremacy culture. I'm hoping that we may hear this discussion differently when we look at it through that lens. And I want to make a whole bunch of caveats about today and about this series overall. First of all, let's talk about the term white supremacy culture in this series. I am not talking about white supremacists. That is a different thing altogether. Still a problem in our society, unfortunately. But we're talking about white supremacy culture, and let's talk about where that comes from. If we go back in history, this is just one of many examples. So early settlers, think about folks who came to the U.S. settling into land that was already inhabited and owned by our indigenous folks. When they came from Europe, most of them in leadership were male and Christian. They did not identify at that time as white. They identified with their ethnic, national, or religious roots. They were English, French, Dutch. They were Protestant, they were Catholic, they were Puritans. They came with the desire to create a new world, and yes, let's take in the irony of that, where they could profit and prosper. But once here, they faced a big problem. These ruling class elite and their families were outnumbered by the indigenous folks here, whose lands and land they were stealing, and the Africans who they forcibly kidnapped for enslavement and forced labor and brought here. Because the ruling class elite were outnumbered, they had to persuade newly arriving immigrants from Europe to cast aside their ethnic, national, or religious identities and differences into a solidarity category of white and whiteness, so that they could consolidate that idea of white supremacy as a way to organize these very different immigrants into a singular and unifying racial category. They did this by requiring them to disconnect from their ethnic and national identities in order to gain access to the material, emotional, physical, intellectual, and spiritual benefits of whiteness. A whiteness designed specifically and intentionally to pit them against and place them above indigenous and enslaved people. So when we are talking about white supremacy culture, we are talking about the ways in which the ruling classes or the elite or the powerful in the colonies of what was to become the United States used this pseudo-scientific concept of race to create whiteness and a hierarchy of racialized value in order to disconnect and divide white people from Black and indigenous folks, and to disconnect and divide Black, indigenous, and people of color from each other, to disconnect and divide white people from other white people, and to disconnect and divide each and every one of us from the earth, the sun, the wind, the water, the stars, the animals, all of which united us. And as a result, it ended up disconnecting and dividing each of us from ourselves and from what we consider divine and what unites us. And I want to emphasize another thing about white supremacy culture, is that it does not just affect white folks. Some of you, in what I must say is white supremacy culture fashion, thinks this is just about being white. I've heard some people express questions thinking that white supremacy culture is the culture of whites, and it's making them not understanding the culture of black folks. But that's not all it is. We're saying here that we are all living in this culture, all of us. This is the culture in the US and much of the Western world, and how it affects everyone who lives in that culture. Everyone. And that culture is actively working us to keeping us disconnected from each other and ourselves and the earth. I'm hoping that that makes a little bit more sense about what we're talking about. One more caveat. I don't need you to necessarily agree with Akun's words. They are one perspective about white supremacy culture. They're one that a lot of folks have said, maybe we should look at it. But it is not a clear-cut, absolute, applies to every situation kind of thing. They are the kind of thing that makes us think about the culture we're in and how we can be more connected. So there's a whole bunch of things to think about as we talk about it. So let's talk about quality over quantity and how Okun says it is a characteristic of white supremacy culture. It starts with the assumption that the goal of our society is always to be, do, or get more, and to be, do, or get bigger. So let me give you the headline right off the bat, that this leads to an emphasis of what we can objectively measure, essentially how well we are doing at being, doing, or getting more. And that puts at higher value than the quality of the relationships. It places the higher value on the quantity. So a focus on quantity over quality shows up as perhaps more or all of given resources being directed towards producing quantitatively measurable goals. That means that things can be counted are more highly valued than things that cannot. So for example, numbers of people attending a meeting, a newsletter circulation, money raised and spent are valued more than the quality of the meeting or the relationships being built or the democratic decision-making process or the ability to constructively deal with conflict, morale, or mutual support. That mutual aid that Katie was talking about in our Together time. It's the idea that little or no value is attached to the process that we're going through, and most of it is attached to the goals or the outcome. And it's this internalized belief that if it can't be measured, it doesn't have the same kind of value. This results in there being more value in those concrete, measurable things rather than non-concrete emotions and feelings. So let's think of this in the context of a meeting. I know you've all had meetings. You may have had several in this past week. There's the content of the meeting and there's the process of the meeting. There's the agenda that people want to go through. Quantity over quality means that you get to go through the agenda, check the items off, often with little focus on the process, which might include stopping the agenda and seeing how people are feeling, checking in on how they're doing, or resolving some conflict at the expense of getting all of the things on the agenda done. Now, there are two big implications of quantity versus quality, both of them that tie into our previous topics of perfectionism and urgency. With perfectionism, we are trying to get it right. We are trying to say that it is right if we make a metric and we meet it. If we can quantify it, then we know we did it right. But if we're defining success by building relationships, having people feel safe and connected, then how do we know if it was right? And it connects with urgency because quantity thinking usually enables short-term thinking because there's a focus on quantitative goals, even if they're unrealistic. And there is a rush to achieve those measurable items. So this leads to the idea that bigger and more is better and less is not better. Let's look at this in the context of an organization, a congregation perhaps. If an organization assumes the goal is to grow, to add staff, to add members, add projects, serve more people, regardless of how well they are serving them, or if it's to raise more money or gain more influence or power, it may often do this without regard to the organization's mission, or especially to the people or living things that the organization is in relationship with. There is often not enough ability to consider the cost of growth in social, emotional, psychic, embodied, spiritual, and financial realms. It gives us a very narrow focus on the numbers, like the finances and the people and the power, without the ability to value the process of building relationships and the cost to the environment. I think you can probably all see how this very much ties into our capitalistic society as well. This is some of the challenges that many of us feel. This whole premise is saying that quantity over quality is a part of our culture and that it is harming our ability to be with one another. And that ability is central to building relationships to each other and ourselves. And then making that final connection that building relationships with each other is a key component of dismantling systems of racism and oppression. So how do we dismantle this idea of quantity over quality? There's a lot of different ways. Amy talked about having quality time. Katie talked about mutual aid. Let's look at some other antidotes and imagine. So imagine if instead of this idea of quantity, we adopted the ancient Haudenosaunee or Iroquois philosophy that the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. How would that change our short-term, numbers-driven culture? Imagine if any cost-benefit analysis that anyone ever did included all the costs, not just the financial ones. What if we took into account the cost in morale, the cost in credibility, the cost in relationship to living beings, the cost of the use of our resources? Imagine if we decided that process was just as important as outcome. What if our goal spoke to how we did the work, not just what we were doing? What if we actually measured that? Can we measure mutually respectful relationships or how we are protecting the earth? What if we had the courage to recognize when we need to go off the planned agenda in order to address people's underlying concerns with the knowledge that doing so will result in a more solid outcome in the long term? So we've been talking about this generally, and believe me, it is a challenge this time of the year. But let's put some of these in the context of gift giving, eating, drinking, scheduling time of overconsumption that is Western Christmas time in particular. So growth is a part of life and necessary. We need to grow in order to thrive. But how do we distinguish growth from just needing more? Do we really need more? More for the sake of just more. More stuff, more power, more money, more. Why do we need more, really? What are the psychological reasons we are craving more? In this culture and in this time, what measures or counterproductive ways of thinking can we put in place to help us stay grounded in what is important? Akun gives us these possibilities of things we can measure instead. How many times did we laugh together today? How many times did we express gratitude? How many times did we allow silence? How many times did we encourage and allow conflict? We can choose to be accountable to people and to principles over profit and numbers. We can envision a world where people and all living things come first, where we honor the idea of 7-generation thinking and the interdependence of all of the web of existence, as our 7th principle states. We recognize that many of us have to work in jobs where quantity is prioritized, but we still have an awful lot of power in our lives to maintain our connection with each other and to the earth and to all that nurtures our ability to thrive together. December is an excellent time to look at this and practice it. Practice it over and over again so that we can grow our ability to prioritize each other over profit and growth and power. May your December be abundant, but abundant in the things that build connection, generate good feelings, and create more love in the world. May you embrace the idea that relying on more presents, more food, more things to do, may create a situation where you have less connection. And may you do that not only for your own heart, but for those with whom you can connect. Because connection is how we dismantle oppression. May it be so for your December and your life.